I am General of the Army's Ulysses S. Grant, and I thank you for joining me here today in the War Room. And today I shall reflect about the deadly assault by federal forces on Robert E. Lee's Confederate forces at Cold Harbor, Virginia, the morning of June the 3rd of 1864. I do not purpose to discuss the military movement, strategy, tactics of what went on and who did what. My purpose is to discuss why I ordered that deadly attack. I expect there will be many, if not multitudes, of historians and students of the war to read about who did what and where they did it, how they did it. There will be many surmisations and suppositions, but my purpose is limited this day to discussing why I did what I did. We crossed the Rapidan River the night of May the 4th, going into May the 5th of 64, and what is now become known as the Overland Campaign. My objective was to keep Robert E. Lee in the Army of Northern Virginia engaged, to destroy his army if I could. At minimum, to keep him pinned in Virginia so he could not go south to join with Joe Johnston or anyone else in the South and make a formidable army in combination with the Army of Northern Virginia and whomever he may link. Richmond was never my goal. Richmond has no value, or very little military value. It has primarily moral value, if we could take the Confederate capital. But where Robert E. Lee was, there I proposed to be. After 28 days of almost non-stop combat in our military minuet southeast through Virginia, we came to the crossroads at Cold Harbor, Old Cold Harbor, New Cold Harbor. And for those of you who may not know, there's nothing cold there, and it's not a harbor. There's no water. It's not far from the James River or the Chickahominy, but there's no water. Harbor is an old English term for inn, and Cold Harbor is an inn where hot food is not served. So a cold harbor is an inn where one could expect bedding and cold food, and that goes back into time immemorial. At Cold Harbor, there were 5 roads that came to a juncture, nexus, and they led to Richmond. It also was access to the James River. That's why we were boiling in that way. And since the beginning of my engagement with Lee in the wilderness on the 6th of May, I've been flanking to the left in a southeastern circle trying to get between Lee and Richmond. And he was tethered to Richmond and had to keep between me and Richmond. When we got to Cold Harbor, May 31st, with some sharp fighting occurring, Sheridan and cavalry meeting Confederate infantry, and more men coming in from the Federals, Lee sensing something was happening, being afraid that I was going for Richmond, brought in troops, and a major collision quickly began to shape up from small beginnings, as often happens. I was frustrated with delays. I wanted to attack Lee on June the 1st, wanted to attack on June the 2nd in the morning, the afternoon of June 2nd, finally had to schedule it for daylight on June the 3rd. Lee had gone into works that were 6 to 7 miles long. We're only 10 miles at this location, 9 or 10 miles to Richmond. Lee occupied the earthworks and fortifications that were left over from 2 years prior when he defeated McClellan in the ill-famed Peninsula Campaign. And he had those works to occupy. This was exemplary, these delays, of a military axiom that I subscribe to, in that time not well used accrues benefits to the enemy that he did not earn. Lee made good use of that 48 hours or so of the 1st and the 2nd when I couldn't get my army in place for the attack, and heavily fortified those earthworks. He had enfilading fire of musketry and artillery. He brought in thousands upon thousands of his men and was waiting across an open field, a killing ground, for us to assault, which he knew was going to come. I was anxious to hit him because it was my last chance, I felt, to meet Lee in the open, and I was going to hit him. By the time that daybreak occurred on the morning of June the 3rd, it had rained heavily during the night, and with the heat and the summer, there was a heavy fog. But at about 4:30, between 4:30 and 5, 60,000 federal troops stepped out in 2 ranks in a line of assault that ran nearly 7 miles. And that was, I suspect, the largest massing of troops, I believe, that had ever been brought about for one assault. And they approached the most heavily fortified line that they had, that large mass of troops had assaulted. And it was absolute slaughter. In an hour, or a little less, we suffered 7,000 casualties. Now that's not 7,000 dead, as the journalists that were present heard those numbers and immediately assumed they were dead, not killed and wounded. Actually, there was about 2,000 dead and the rest wounded or missing. But nonetheless, it was the bloodiest hour in the the history of the United States Army. It was so deadly that in many places, and I hit mainly the center and the right of the enemy, the dead were piled up in triangular piles from the enfilading fire, with the bravest men making it the furthest, and the bodies were piled up in triangles, a ghastly sight. Most of the casualties occurred in the first 20 minutes or so. It was a slaughter. The only way a man could survive, the soldiers said, was to hug the ground and hope that the missiles went over you. I heard that day that when I was considering and asking my officers, commanders, Hancock and Wright and Smith of the 2nd, 6th, and 18th Corps, who had done the bulk of the attack, about making another attack, that one of the commanders involved, a colonel I believe, had said, "I'm not going to order my men to make that charge again. I don't care if Jesus Christ himself came to me and ordered me to make that assault. I would not do it." And one of the Confederate officers facing this was shocked with what he witnessed, and he said, "This is not war, but murder." When I asked my 3 primary commanding officers, Hancock said he didn't think it could be done for the second assault to be made. Horatio Wright said he thought he could do it, but he would have to have the support of Hancock and Smith. Smith said he thought he could do it, he thought it could be done, but he was not sanguine about the results. And I was beginning to hear that if I did order another assault, I might have a mutiny on my hands. Men were not going to make that charge again. So I ordered them to stand down about midday, about noon or so, and there was no more, except some desultory fighting. Why did I do that? I did it because we'd been fighting for, by that time, the morning of the 3rd, 28 days of almost nonstop combat. Casualties had been horrendous. Some, at that time, about 60,000, 65,000 Federal and some 35,000 Confederate. Our casualties had been so heavy that I had lost more casualties than Lee had men in his army when he started the campaign and met me in the wilderness. That's how bloody it was. It was ghastly. Men were exhausted, frayed nerves, and almost beyond their capacity to maintain any kind of fighting capability. But I thought that with that many men, 60,000 men that I could bring to bear, that we could punch through and hit Lee's center and fold that line and defeat him in detail. I thought the Confederates are fought out and worn out, that they were physically exhausted. I thought that they were morally, mentally exhausted, and that they would not be able to stand against such an onslaught, and that we could punch through them like a spear through their lines. And I was wrong. In reflection, I think about the similarity between the charge on the morning of June 3rd and Pickett's charge on the 3rd day at Gettysburg. I did the same thing that Lee did with Pickett at Gettysburg at Cold Harbor on June the 3rd of 64. For the same reasons, I thought that I'll hit them with a massed force in their center, essentially, and that they're fought out, worn out, and too thin to resist me. And as was Lee with Pickett, I, for the same reasons, was wrong. Lee had used those 2 days. He accrued benefits that he did not earn, and he took existing earthworks and hardened them to where they were impregnable. He brought in massed numbers of troops, as Meade had done at Pickett's charge at Gettysburg. He had fortified that line behind that stone wall and was waiting for Pickett, going across that open ground, as my soldiers had to go across that open ground to attack, assault the Confederate works. And another similarity in reverse to Pickett. Pickett lost, I think, 6,000 killed and wounded, some 2,000 killed. The 6,000 casualties, Meade sustained about 1,500. With my assault at Cold Harbor, I lost 7,000 casualties, and Lee lost about 1,500 casualties. So the numbers were almost exactly reversed. But I did what I did at Cold Harbor for essentially the same reasons that Lee did. I thought my boys could do it. I thought they were exhausted physically, exhausted mentally, their morale was gone, and that with heavily superior numbers, we could hit them in the center and buckle them and carry the day. And that is exactly why I did what I did at Cold Harbor. And like Lee with Pickett, I suffered a failure, a ghastly, bloody failure. That's one of the 2 decisions of the war that I regret having made. And under similar circumstances, given the same circumstances, I would never order that assault again. And in my report, I said at the time, and in my report, we gained absolutely no advantage to compensate for the losses that we sustained. And I regret that I ordered the charge. And that is why I ordered the charge. And it saddens me greatly. It pains me to think of what happened that day upon my order. So that's why I did what I did at Cold Harbor on June the 3rd of 1864. And my heart is heavy because of it, and I suspect it always will be. For now, I have painfully this time said quite enough, and I must bid you a fond farewell.